Welcome to InfoStream, your daily current. Unsure what to listen to? Turn to us for today's headlines. Stay informed. U.S. peace plan faces uncertainty. Fossil fuel pledge negotiations fail at COP30. Israel attacks Hezbollah leader. Nigeria experiences increased abductions. Gaza violence escalates after ceasefire. Ethiopia-Eritrea tensions rise. Germany reinstates conscription. Bolsonaro arrested. Security increased. Venezuela grapples with economic crisis. Federal Reserve analyzes mixed economic data. Telegraph sold in $650 million deal. Land bridge project under review. Thailand calls for reform and sustainability. U.S. deportations spark asylum concerns. Trump nomination faces scrutiny. U.S.-backed peace plan sparks mixed reactions amidst tightening deadline. AAU's proposed peace plan aimed at resolving the conflict in Ukraine is facing a rapidly approaching deadline and a complex mix of reactions, primarily centered around concerns regarding its potential implications for Ukraine's sovereignty and defense capabilities. Donald Trump's administration has presented a 28-point framework demanding that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky accept limitations on military support, including a restriction on NATO alliances, in exchange for an end to hostilities. This proposal has ignited apprehension within Ukraine and among its international allies. The core of the controversy lies in the plan's stipulations, which critics argue effectively cede control of Ukraine's foreign policy and significantly weaken its security posture against continued Russian aggression. Western leaders have voiced serious reservations, emphasizing the need for a durable peace that respects Ukraine's territorial integrity and right to self-determination. A Western diplomat expressed fears that the U.S. intends to exclude European powers from the negotiation process. Zelensky's administration is proceeding with cautious engagement, preparing for a constructive conversation despite the demanding conditions. Trump, however, has dismissed the plan as non-final, indicating a willingness to maintain pressure on Russia. A separate initiative is underway to convene a meeting between a Russian delegation and the U.S., though it will not occur in Geneva. Amidst these developments, a proposed meeting between EU leaders is scheduled for Monday, following an announcement by European Council President Antonio Costa. French President Emmanuel Macron will lead a video call involving the coalition of the willing, supporting Kiev. The situation remains fluid, with significant uncertainty surrounding the timeline and ultimate outcome of these diplomatic efforts. The critical deadline of less than a week further intensifies the pressure on both sides to reach a resolution. No agreement reached on new fossil fuel pledges at COP30 in Brazil. The 30th United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP30, held in Belém, Brazil, concluded without a significant agreement on new commitments to reduce reliance on fossil fuels. Despite efforts by over 80 nations, including the UK and EU, a final deal failed to incorporate direct references to phasing out oil, coal, and gas. The primary obstacle was resistance from major oil-producing countries, who argued for the right to determine their own climate strategies. A key outcome of the summit was the commitment to triple climate finance for vulnerable nations. Approximately $120 billion of the targeted $300 billion climate finance goal will be dedicated to adaptation measures in countries most susceptible to climate change impacts. This reflects a recognition of historical responsibility for greenhouse gas emissions. Significant progress was made on deforestation efforts, with the launch of the Tropical Forests Forever facility, securing $6.6 billion in pledges. This fund aims to incentivize countries to protect their tropical forests, vital carbon sinks. However, the summit's lack of ambition regarding fossil fuels was a point of contention. Many delegates expressed frustration at the continued prioritization of economic interests over climate science. The absence of U.S. President Donald Trump, who challenged the global consensus, further complicated negotiations. Despite the challenges, the summit showcased real-world solutions and highlighted the urgency of addressing climate change. The event underscored the complex interplay of economic, political, and environmental factors in shaping global climate action. The final agreement represents a cautious step forward, acknowledging the need for continued collaboration and innovation in tackling the world's most pressing environmental challenge. The focus now shifts to implementing existing commitments and building momentum for more decisive action in the years ahead. Israel targets Hezbollah chief of staff in Beirut. Recent escalating tensions between Israel and Hezbollah have culminated in a significant Israeli military operation targeting Hezbollah's chief of staff, Haytham Ali Tabatabai, in Beirut's southern suburbs. This marks the first such strike on the capital in months, resulting in at least 5 fatalities and 28 injuries, according to the Lebanese Health Ministry. The attack, conducted by the Israeli Defense Forces (IDF), aimed to disrupt Hezbollah's efforts to rebuild its military capabilities including weapons smuggling and explosive drone production, following the group's actions in solidarity with Palestinians in Gaza. The IDF described Tabatabai as a key operative and veteran, and a leader overseeing Hezbollah's armament buildup. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu ordered the strike based on recommendations from the Minister of Defense and the IDF Chief of Staff. This action underscores Israel's continued determination to counter Hezbollah's threat to Israeli civilians and its ongoing military operations within southern Lebanon and the Bekaa Valley. Previous Israeli strikes, including one in September 2024 that eliminated Hezbollah's longtime leader Hassan Nasrallah, have weakened the group's military leadership. The operation highlights a persistent stalemate despite a ceasefire brokered by the US and France last November. Despite the agreement, Israel continues to target Hezbollah infrastructure and fighters. The United States has designated Tabatabai as a terrorist, offering a $5 million reward for information leading to his apprehension. The U.S. has repeatedly emphasized the need for Lebanon to disarm Hezbollah and curtail its activities. Israeli officials have warned that stepped-up military action is imminent if progress on disarmament remains insufficient. Lebanese President Joseph Aoun has vehemently criticized Israel's actions, accusing it of rejecting any negotiated settlement. The ongoing conflict reflects a complex dynamic involving regional power struggles, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and the challenges facing Lebanon's governance. Nigeria sees multiple mass abductions as crisis deepens. Multiple coordinated attacks targeting schools in Nigeria have resulted in the mass abduction of over 315 individuals, marking a significant escalation of violence and insecurity within the country. The most recent incident involved the kidnapping of 303 students and 12 teachers from St. Mary's School in Papiri, Niger State, following an early morning raid by armed gunmen. This event, along with a separate abduction of over 20 schoolgirls from a boarding school in Kebbi State and an attack on a church in Kwara State resulting in 38 abductees, has prompted widespread condemnation and raised serious concerns about the government's ability to protect its citizens. The revised student count from St. Mary's School now stands at nearly half of the school's total student population, a substantial increase from earlier estimates. Authorities confirmed the school had disregarded a prior order to close boarding facilities due to intelligence warnings of heightened attack risks. The ongoing violence mirrors the 2014 Chibok mass abduction, where 276 girls were taken, and highlights the persistent threat posed by criminal gangs, locally known as bandits, who operate with impunity. President Bola Tinubu has postponed international travel, including attendance at the G20 summit in South Africa, to prioritize addressing the security crisis. The government has ordered the closure of over 40 federal colleges and implemented school closures in several states. Despite these measures, the attacks continue, fueled by competition for resources, such as water and land, and the payment of ransoms remains a challenge. The situation is generating considerable anger and fear among the Nigerian populace, demanding stronger action to safeguard children and communities. Investigations are underway, with security agencies combing forests in an attempt to rescue the abducted students. The attacks are not solely driven by religious motives, but rather by resource conflicts and criminal activity, with the Boko Haram group's legacy continuing to cast a long shadow. Escalating violence in Gaza following ceasefire violations. Recent days have witnessed a significant escalation of violence in Gaza following a 6-week ceasefire agreement, with Israeli airstrikes resulting in the deaths of 22 Palestinians. The conflict stems from accusations exchanged by both sides regarding violations of the truce. Israeli military forces asserted that they retaliated after an armed terrorist breached the Yellow Line, a designated area under Israeli control, and attacked soldiers. Hamas vehemently denied these accusations, stating that 5 sites were targeted, including residential homes, and that a senior Hamas commander was among the fatalities. The strikes primarily concentrated in northern and central Gaza, specifically targeting Gaza City's Abbas Junction and areas within the Remel densely populated area. Alongside strikes in Deir al-Bala and Nuseirat camp, multiple families were tragically impacted, with homes of the Abu Amoun and Abu Shawish families destroyed, resulting in several deaths. Following the attacks, Prime Minister Netanyahu stated that Hamas had broken the ceasefire by sending an assailant into Israeli-controlled territory. He demanded that mediators enforce Hamas's obligations within the agreement. Hamas responded by condemning Israel's westward expansion of the Yellow Line and continued bombardment of eastern Gaza, labeling it a blatant breach of the truce. They urged the U.S. and other mediators to intervene urgently, warning of Israel's attempts to alter the situation on the ground and undermine the fragile ceasefire. The ongoing conflict has resulted in a mounting death toll, with Gaza's health ministry reporting at least 69, 500 Palestinians killed since October 7th, including 280 deaths during the ceasefire period. This latest surge in violence underscores the persistent instability and the difficulties in achieving a lasting resolution to the conflict, rooted in the October 7th Hamas-led attack on Israel, which resulted in 200 fatalities and the capture of 251 individuals. The situation remains deeply concerning, with a significant number of casualties and ongoing accusations of ceasefire violations. Ethiopia-Eritrea rising tensions threaten regional stability. The relationship between Ethiopia and Eritrea remains deeply strained, escalating into a renewed period of heightened rhetoric and underlying tensions, raising fears of renewed conflict. The core of the dispute centers on Ethiopia's demand for access to the Red Sea through Eritrea's port of Asab, a long-standing grievance stemming from Eritrea's secession in 1993. Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's declarations regarding regaining access to the sea have fueled the conflict, with military officials openly threatening action, including the assertion of ownership over Asab. Ethiopia state media actively promotes this narrative, portraying the loss of access to the Red Sea as an unjust outcome and mobilizing online support. Simultaneously, Ethiopia has been bolstering its military capabilities, showcasing increased troop numbers and new weaponry. Eritrea, under President Isaias Afwerki, has responded with measured condemnation, warning of dire consequences for Ethiopia if it attempts to seize Asab. The Eritrean army has implemented restrictions on troop movements, maintaining a defensive posture. The historical context is crucial, dating back to Italian colonial rule and subsequent transitions. A protracted civil war concluded in 1991, followed by Eritrea's independence in 1993. Despite initial cooperation, disagreements over the border persisted, culminating in a devastating war in 1998-2000. Recent alliances between the two nations during the Tigray conflict in 2020-2022 were abruptly broken, leading to the current crisis. While no major military movements have been reported on the ground, the escalating rhetoric and preparations by both sides are concerning. Eritrea's state media accuses Ethiopia of attempting to destabilize the region, while Ethiopian media amplifies its claims of historical injustice. The situation is further complicated by the involvement of foreign media outlets, some of which are shifting their stance to support Eritrea's defense. The potential for a full-scale conflict remains a significant threat to regional stability, demanding careful diplomacy and de-escalation efforts. Germany reintroduces conscription as military modernization efforts intensify. Germany is undertaking a significant shift in its defense strategy, spearheaded by Chancellor Friedrich Merz's pledge to build Europe's strongest army. This initiative involves a new conscription bill, aiming to bolster the Bundeswehr and a planned increase in military spending. The government intends to raise the army's numbers to 260,000 soldiers, up from approximately 180,000, with an additional 200,000 reservists by 2035. Initially, the plan relies on voluntary enlistment, offering a starting salary of $600 per month, an increase from the current level to incentivize recruitment. However, if recruitment targets aren't met, the government reserves the option of mandatory call-ups. Starting next year, 18-year-olds will receive questionnaires regarding their interest in service, with this requirement compulsory for men. Mandatory medical examinations will also be introduced for men aged 18 in 2027. This move is largely driven by the perceived threat from Russia, particularly following the ongoing war in Ukraine, and warnings from NATO regarding a potential Russian attack. The government's strategy reflects a shift away from decades of underfunding and neglect of the Bundeswehr, which has historically operated below 2% of Germany's GDP, a NATO benchmark, due to a lack of perceived threats and a strong pacifist tradition. Chancellor Merz argues that Russia understands only the language of power. The coalition government, comprised of the CDU and SPD, initially debated different approaches, eventually scrapping a lottery-style conscription proposal in favor of incentives. Defense Minister Boris Pistorius is advocating for an emphasis on pay and financial compensation. Despite this shift, resistance remains. Applications for conscientious objector status have surged since the start of the war in Ukraine, reaching 3034 between January and October 2024, the highest since 2011. Many Germans, particularly from the left-wing Die Linke party, oppose mandatory conscription. Concerns exist about the potential impact on young people's education and a general reluctance to embrace military service, stemming from Germany's historical experience. The government's goal is to create a modern, capable army, setting an example for other European allies, but the path forward remains contentious. Jair Bolsonaro's arrest and increased security measures. Jair Bolsonaro, the former Brazilian president, was taken into custody following a determination that he posed a concrete flight risk while under house arrest. This decision followed the Supreme Court's assessment of new facts emerging regarding his potential escape attempts. Initially found guilty of orchestrating a military coup and sentenced to over 27 years in prison, Bolsonaro has remained under house arrest pending appeals. The court's decision to detain him was a preventative measure prompted by concerns about his intention to disable his electronic ankle monitor. Bolsonaro admitted to destroying the monitor's case with a soldering iron, claiming it was due to curiosity, but vehemently denied attempting to remove the device. Authorities believe he planned to utilize a rally organized by his son, Flávio Bolsonaro, a senator, as a cover for his escape. Flávio Bolsonaro called for a gathering of supporters near his father's home, framing it as a demonstration for health and democracy. The proximity of the U.S. Embassy in Brasilia, just 13 km away, further fueled security concerns. Bolsonaro's legal team requested the Supreme Court to allow him to serve his entire sentence under house arrest with electronic monitoring, and to permit him to leave his residence for medical treatment, citing his need for regular pulmonary infection management. However, his lawyers emphasized that he did not intend to escape and highlighted the 24-hour armed guard protecting his home. The situation has garnered international attention, particularly from U.S. President Donald Trump, who has responded by imposing a 50% tariff on Brazilian goods. Bolsonaro is currently held in a police station in Brasilia and is scheduled for a custody hearing on Sunday. The escalating security measures reflect the ongoing legal challenges and the perceived threat posed by Bolsonaro's attempts to circumvent the judicial process. The situation underscores the complexities of the legal proceedings and the heightened vigilance surrounding the former president's movements. Venezuelan concerns center on economic crisis, not imminent invasion. The primary concern for ordinary Venezuelans, according to recent reports, is not a potential U.S. military invasion, but rather the escalating economic crisis, particularly the soaring cost of food and the devaluation of the Bolivar currency. Amidst heightened tensions fueled by U.S. military deployments, including the positioning of warships and the cancellation of international flights, Venezuelans are grappling with daily struggles to afford basic necessities. The rapid depreciation of the Bolivar, having lost 80% of its value this year, has driven food prices dramatically higher, often 4 times the official minimum wage. The situation is compounded by a climate of fear and self-censorship, following widespread anti-government protests and the disputed 2024 presidential elections, resulting in the arrest of over 2,000 individuals. Many Venezuelans are hesitant to openly discuss sensitive issues for fear of reprisal. This silence is evident across various sectors, from merchants in Ciudad Bolivar to a pastry chef and a medical lab technician. Despite the anxieties surrounding potential U.S. intervention, many Venezuelans express a lack of belief in an imminent attack, prioritizing their immediate survival. The fear of arrest and imprisonment, coupled with the precarious economic conditions, has led to a pervasive sense of apprehension and quiet desperation. Economists consulted by the BBC estimate monthly inflation rates reaching around 20%, projecting a staggering 5.48% price increase this year, potentially soaring to 6.29% in 2026. The international community's rejection of the disputed election results and the subsequent actions of the U.S. government have only exacerbated the situation, contributing to the overall sense of uncertainty and vulnerability among the Venezuelan population. While some express hope for a necessary change, the prevailing sentiment is one of cautious waiting and quiet concern, focusing on navigating the daily realities of a struggling nation. The fear of potential violence and the limitations imposed by the political climate underscore the core challenges facing Venezuela today. Fed grapples with divergent economic signals. The Federal Reserve is facing a complex and concerning situation as U.S. economic growth continues despite a weakening labor market, presenting a significant challenge to monetary policy decisions. Recent data reveals a disconnect between robust GDP growth, fueled by investments in artificial intelligence and resilient consumer spending, and a slowdown in job creation. The Labor Department reports a meager pace of job gains over the past 3 months, averaging around 62,000, alongside persistently high worker productivity. This divergence has created a particularly challenging environment for Fed policy decisions, as highlighted in their October meeting minutes. Economists, including Ryan Sweet of Oxford Economics, warn that the next monetary policy narrative will center on managing a jobless expansion, questioning how to incentivize businesses to increase hiring. Several factors contribute to this situation. Business investment in information processing equipment and software, a key driver of GDP, accounts for 40% of GDP, slightly below the peak reached during the dot-com boom. Strong consumer spending has also supported company profits. However, this investment often comes at the expense of hiring. Furthermore, policy changes enacted by the Trump administration, particularly concerning trade and immigration, are believed to be impacting both labor supply and demand, contributing to the labor market's weakness. Economist James Ragan of D.A. Davidson emphasizes the vulnerability of the U.S. economy to any negative developments within a jobless expansion. The Fed is considering further rate cuts, with projections indicating several cuts through 2026, but hesitation is growing. Dallas Fed President Lori Logan expressed reluctance to implement additional cuts unless inflation falls faster or the labor market cools more rapidly. The possibility of a recession is a significant concern, as a fraying labor market could quickly derail economic growth. Fed Governor Christopher Waller recently described the divergence as a conflict that needs to resolve itself, acknowledging the inherent risk. The situation underscores the delicate balance the Fed must maintain, carefully assessing economic indicators and considering the potential consequences of its policy decisions. The persistent strength of economic growth further complicates the Fed's approach, making aggressive rate cuts less appealing. The future of the U.S. economy hinges on whether this divergent trend will correct itself, or if the Fed will be forced to make a difficult and potentially impactful policy choice. DMGT acquires the Telegraph in £650 million deal. UK media group Daily Mail. DMGT has finalised a £500 million, £650 million deal to acquire the Telegraph newspaper, creating a significant right-leaning media powerhouse. The acquisition follows a protracted process complicated by regulatory hurdles and internal resistance within the Telegraph's newsroom. Initially, a Redbird Capital Partners IMI joint venture had secured control of the Telegraph Media Group and the Spectator magazine in 2023, but the UK government subsequently blocked foreign state investment in UK newspapers. Redbird then attempted to obtain approval under a revised structure with Abu Dhabi-backed IMI as a minority investor, capped at 15%. The deal's timeline has been significantly impacted by a slower than expected regulatory clearance process, initially fueling doubts about the acquisition's feasibility. Internal opposition from the Telegraph's editorial staff further contributed to the withdrawal of the Redbird IMI consortium. The Financial Times reported the final price as approximately £500 million intended to repay the funds previously spent by the initial joint venture. DMGT, whose stable of media brands includes the Mail on Sunday Metro, the iPaper, and New Scientist, had previously expressed interest in acquiring the Telegraph in 2023. The acquisition is structured to comply with the UK's foreign state influence regime, ensuring no direct foreign state investment or capital is involved. A period of exclusivity has been established to finalize the transaction and prepare necessary regulatory submissions, with parties anticipating a swift process. Redbird IMI spokesperson confirmed the agreement's imminent submission to the Secretary of State. The Telegraph has not yet issued a formal response. This acquisition represents a major shift in the British media landscape, consolidating power within a single group with a clearly defined editorial stance. Land Bridge project faces scrutiny over flawed environmental assessment. A growing controversy surrounds the planned Land Bridge megaproject due to significant discrepancies between the government's environmental impact assessment and independent scientific findings. The project, aiming to create a 90-kilometer transport corridor linking ports in Ranong and Chumphan, is facing criticism over a state-sponsored EHIA that drastically underestimates the biodiversity of the South's marine ecosystems. The initial government report claimed only 7 units of a single bottom-dwelling species per square meter, a stark contrast to previous research indicating up to 200 species per square meter. This discrepancy, revealed through a recent independent survey conducted with media present, showcased a much richer seabed environment including multiple crustaceans, polychaetes, mollusks, and starfish within a small area. Marine scientists, environmentalists, and local fishing communities have strongly condemned the EHI as a sham, highlighting the lack of transparency and the potential for severe environmental damage. The survey, involving 20 stations in Ranong waters, demonstrated the presence of diverse marine life, directly contradicting the government's assessment. Beyond the flawed seabed survey, broader concerns exist regarding the EHIA's limited scope, excluding critical impact zones like Koh Phayan, coral reefs, and several coastal communities. The report also failed to adequately assess potential impacts on local livelihoods, tourism, and pollution risks, ignoring a Chulalongkorn University study concluding the project's economic unviability. The project's backers, largely Chinese investors, are granted 99-year leases and the authority to override local land use, environmental, labor, and immigration laws through the Southern Economic Corridor framework. Critics argue the project is too costly, inefficient, and destructive, potentially replicating the negative impacts of the Eastern Economic Corridor. The government's dismissal of dissenting voices as anti-national underscores the urgency of addressing these concerns. The flawed EHIA and the surrounding circumstances threaten to undermine public trust and jeopardize the future of the land bridge project. The situation demands a thorough reassessment of the project's environmental and social implications before proceeding. Urgent reform and environmental stewardship in Thailand. The articles highlight a critical need for comprehensive reform within Thailand's police force, alongside a renewed commitment to environmental protection and sustainable development. The first article emphasizes the imperative for concrete action regarding police corruption, urging Prime Minister Anutin Charnvirakul to enact the recommendations of former graft busters, including proposals from Paul Gen Vasset de Conjourn dating back to 2010. These reforms, centered on increased compensation and decentralized regional policing, were previously overlooked despite support from the opposition. The author stresses the importance of immediate implementation, rather than continued rhetoric. The second article focuses on the vital role of trees and forests in mitigating environmental challenges. It argues that trees are not merely aesthetic assets, but crucial living infrastructure, particularly important for farmers in rural areas and urban residents alike. Trees' ability to absorb rainfall, prevent soil erosion, and reduce urban flooding is underscored, especially in light of climate change and increasing urbanization. The article advocates for expanded tree planting programs in urban areas, alongside incentivizing farmers to integrate trees into their agricultural practices through agroforestry schemes. Furthermore, the article calls for strengthened law enforcement against illegal logging and the expansion of community forestry programs, with schools and universities playing a role in embedding tree planting into civic education. It emphasizes a shift in perspective, viewing tree cover as essential infrastructure for flood prevention and climate resilience. Ultimately, the articles collectively paint a picture of a nation needing to prioritize both systemic reform and sustainable environmental stewardship, with local authorities and citizens taking responsibility for protecting and expanding Thailand's natural resources. The underlying message is that long-term prosperity hinges on immediate action and a fundamental shift in values. U.S. deportations of Iranian converts raise asylum concerns. Recent U.S. policy changes have resulted in the unprecedented deportation of over 120 Iranian nationals, primarily Christian converts, back to Iran, sparking significant concerns regarding the fairness and consistency of U.S. asylum procedures. The strategy, involving chartered flights facilitated through Qatar, marks a departure from established diplomatic relations and raises questions about the handling of sensitive religious information within asylum claims. Several Iranian Christian converts, speaking anonymously due to fear for their safety and the safety of their families, have recounted harrowing experiences. Majid, for instance, was forcibly removed after a year in U.S. immigration detention, while Sina reported armed guards escorting passengers on the flight to Tehran. The key issue revolves around inconsistencies in how U.S. authorities assess the risks faced by returnees and the handling of information related to religious conversions, political activity, and reasons for seeking asylum. Legal experts, such as Ali Hariski, highlight a critical mistake: sensitive information, including accounts of religious conversion and political activity, was reportedly not removed from asylum files before deportation. This has led to dire consequences for individuals like Ali and his wife, who now face potential persecution upon return. Iranian intelligence is actively pursuing Ali's wife, adding to the danger. The situation is further complicated by the fact that converts represent a significant portion of Iran's Christian population, which is tightly controlled and faces persecution. Arrests and interrogations related to religious practice have increased dramatically, with authorities increasingly labeling converts as Zionist Christians to frame their religious activity as a national security threat. Despite concerns, U.S. authorities maintain that all deportees had undergone full asylum adjudication. However, outcomes within individual households have varied significantly. Marjan and Reza, both Christian converts, experienced divergent fates. Marjan was granted asylum, while Reza was ordered to be removed to a third country. The cases underscore the challenges in assessing the sincerity of faith and the potential for abuse within the asylum system. The Center for Human Rights in Iran reports a six-fold increase in arrests related to religious practice since recent Iran-Israel clashes. The overall trend highlights the vulnerability of Iranian Christian converts and the urgent need for a more just and compassionate approach to asylum claims. Trump nominee faces scrutiny over alleged concerns regarding American Muslim loyalty. A recent nomination of a Trump ally for a senior position within the United Nations has ignited controversy, primarily due to questions raised about the individual's views and potential biases concerning American Muslims. CNN reported that the nominee, a prominent conservative activist, was facing scrutiny from within the UN and among advocacy groups regarding his expressed sentiments and perceived implications for the rights and safety of American Muslims. The controversy centers around statements made by the nominee in the past, specifically concerning the broader Muslim community, which critics interpreted as reflecting a lack of inclusivity and potentially fueling Islamophobia. These statements, detailed in various reports, were seen as undermining the UN's stated commitment to protecting religious freedom and combating discrimination. The nomination itself, intended to fill a key role within the UN's Human Rights Division, immediately drew criticism from Muslim rights organizations and democratic lawmakers. These groups argued that the nomination demonstrated a troubling alignment between the Trump administration's policies and the UN's human rights agenda. They voiced concerns that the nominee's views could influence the UN's approach to issues such as refugee protection, religious freedom, and counterterrorism efforts. The situation underscores the ongoing tension between the U.S. government's approach to international relations and the UN's mandate to uphold human rights globally. The nomination has sparked a debate about the role of political considerations in shaping international institutions and the importance of ensuring inclusivity and respect for all religious communities within the UN system. The controversy highlights the potential for political appointments to impact the organization's credibility and effectiveness.